Okay, so there are no questions about the tape. I put the word I come up with these questions. That's all you got. Okay, well, as you look at this over the weekend, obviously, if there are questions, please let me know. Send me a text, probably more so than an email, and I will try to do my best to get back to you. And we'll do that. Okay? I'm not going to lie, I have not at all looked at y'all's at the test from Tuesday. Today's Thursday, right? It's Thursday. Yeah. I haven't looked at your test yet, so I don't know how you guys did, how you feel about them. I know they were long for that. I'm sorry. I didn't call for the table. Okay. And I guess we will just watch it. Okay, so we're down to our last two topics. Okay. So for the next couple of lectures, we're going to go over resistance training and the adaptations that occur in response to resistance training. Okay. So what I'm going to try to do with all of this is focus you guys on the scientific evidence that we have that demonstrates that certain adaptations are taking place. Okay? So I know that I did a little bit of that with the aerobic training, but we're really going to kind of get into it with all of this. Towards the very end, there's some discussion of cellular mechanisms and intracellular signaling pathways and things that we know there's evidence that they play a role. We'll talk about things like mTOR and whatnot, but we're not going to get way down into the weeds on the intracellular signaling types of things. Okay, if you're interested in that, I've got some papers. I've got a textbook on molecular exercise physiology. If you really care about those kinds of things. But I'll just kind of give you guys a little bit of backstory on kind of how we know that these are the things that are going to happen. Okay? All right. So, as we move our way through, we're going to start this very much like we started the aerobic side. Okay? Let's think about this in the big picture. Okay? Why do people perform resistance training? It's Thursday. We went over across the way to the Huff. What are the bros doing today? Today's back and buys, or is it second chest day, Alex? Or is that Wednesday? I don't know. Could be both. Could be both, all of those things, right? So why do people perform, let's think about it this way. Why do we resistance train? Okay? So we want to be stronger, okay? We want to have bigger muscles. And we'll talk quite a bit about kind of the hows and the whys of these two particular things. Like how much stronger can you get? How much bigger can your muscles get? I assure you that for the most part, what the bros think is going to happen is a gross overestimate on both of those kinds of things. And then the other piece to keep in mind is that in kind of otherwise young-ish, healthy-ish people or in athletes, they may do resistance training to improve sport performance or skill performance or something. And then in older adults or individuals that have a disability, or even if you want to call physical therapy or something like that a form of resistance training, which in some instances it might be, then we may be trying to use resistance training to improve physical function. Okay? And the idea behind all of that is that these first two things, especially an increase in strength, may lead to some sort of an increase in performance or an increase in function. Okay? So that's kind of the big picture behind all of this. This is why people want to strength train. This is why they want to resistance train. Things that we're going to have to talk about, okay, is what's the stimulus? How do we cause something to change? Okay? What do you need to do? We're going to have you guys do resistance training today. I have some ideas on what I would tell you to do. Many of you guys probably also have some ideas. They're probably not that far off from each other. But we are trying to evoke something. We're trying to do something that will stimulate an increase in strength and an increase in size. All right? So we're going to talk a little bit about, well, what the hell is the stimulus? We're then going to talk about what actually changes. We've given you the stimulus. What's going to change to make you stronger? What's going to change to make your muscles bigger? Okay? Those two things are not mutually exclusive. All right? And then we'll spend a little bit of time at the end talking about what we know about the mechanism or mechanisms of change, right? So we provide a stimulus, and then something changes. Let's kind of get into the weeds a little bit on the how and the why of all of that. Okay? So things to keep in mind, just like with aerobic training. Okay? Adaptations that are going to occur in response to resistance training are directly linked to the increased demands placed upon the neuromuscular system. So they are specific. This idea of specificity. If you want to get better at doing squats, you have to squat, right? If you want to get better at doing curls, you have to curl. Whatever the specific demand in those specific muscles, okay, the adaptations that you get are going to occur in direct response to that. And then part of what's going to happen, okay, is that the adaptations that will occur, so getting stronger, having bigger muscles and things, those are going to occur in an effort to limit, okay, the stress placed upon the system from future bouts of exercise that are similar. So if I do 10 push-ups today, if that evokes some sort of an adaptation, the goal from that adaptation is that when I do 10 push-ups tomorrow or a week from now or a month from now, that those 10 push-ups will cause less disruption of homeostasis, okay? They will cause less motor unit recruitment. It will cause less metabolic stress and those kinds of things. Does that make sense? Okay? So if we think about adaptations in that way, that can help us to understand what our stimulus is, right? I know, okay, I need to make my muscles that I use to sprint get stronger so my performance can go up. And that performance is going to involve them doing this particular range of motion at this particular number of times. So I can use that then and kind of figure out, all right, these specific adaptations that I need are going to look like this. So then I need to train in a manner so that I disrupt homeostasis in a similar manner in those muscles through that range of motion for that number of contractions or something that's going to reasonably approximate what I'm going to ask them to do when I perform. Okay? And then we hope then that I'm going to evoke adaptations that will make it better. Okay. So I forgot that I had this. And I usually also try to show this in the aerobic training adaptations. But it's just a way for me to try to show you guys from a flowchart standpoint, because boy, I love a flowchart, all right, how this paradigm of change is going to work, okay? So we could ask Pearson to get up and do some push-ups or some squats for us or something. Right now, we won't, okay? But he's going to exercise. That is going to acutely cause some changes in the muscles that he's using during exercise. Those muscles will sense that there is some force and load on them. There will be some level of metabolic stress. There may be some hormone release instead of release, right? There may be a change in hormones and anything else that's going to accompany it. We could also talk about, yes, heart rate's probably going to go up. Stroke volume's probably going to go up. Cardiac output's going to go up. Creatine phosphate may get depleted. There's all of these things that we've talked about in class up until now. All of those things are going to happen during or kind of right after that one bout of exercise, okay? Those things happening, that's the disruption of homeostasis, right? You do jumping jacks and your heart rate goes up. We can argue that rest is homeostasis. Anything that throws us away from that is a disruption. And the body doesn't always love for that to happen. That disruption of homeostasis, so these things that are acutely changing, those are going to be our stimulus, okay? If we apply that stimulus over and over and over and over again, we should hopefully then get an adaptation, which may be some sort of a chronic change. My muscles get bigger, they get stronger. I change how I recruit my motor units. Maybe I change the firing frequency. I change the metabolic profile in my fiber types, something like that. changes chronically, and ideally then that chronic change allows me to reach my training goal. Okay? All with me so far? Yes? Okay, cool. All right, so let's talk about the stimulus. What is the stimulus? Okay, what do we need? Well, this calls into account something we call progressive overload. So just like with aerobic training, the stimulus that we need in order to disrupt homeostasis and provide this stimulus, we need you to do more than whatever you're used to doing under normal circumstances. So in that way, the stimulus is somewhat the same across whether you're very highly trained or very untrained. It needs to be different. It needs to be more, okay? More repetitions, heavier weights, a greater number of sets, okay? A greater number of days per week of using that particular muscle group. Any of those things can potentially be used, right, as part of our overload protocol, okay? The easiest way to do this is lift a heavier weight. Whatever you're used to lifting, lift something heavy, okay? Or I lift the same thing, but I'm used to doing 3 sets, do a 4th set, okay? Does that kind of make sense? Right. So within our components of a training protocol, the exercises that we do, the relative intensity compared to max weight I can lift on that exercise, the number of sets, the number of reps, the length of my rest periods, the order of exercises, all of these things that come into traditional resistance training programming that many of you have probably seen and had in some of your undergraduate classes, we can manipulate any one of these and get some level of overload, and that overload is going to provide our stimulus. Okay? And so if you guys will see, because the adaptations are going to be very specific to how we're choosing to overload, that if I overload by doing squats, okay, I'm going to get better at doing squats, which makes a little bit of a problem if I'm doing the squats in an effort to help me run faster, right? Because then I'm doing something that uses the same muscles for the most part. It may put those joints and things through a similar range of motion, but it may not, but it's not running. So it's going to be specific. If you do a certain number of sets and a certain number of reps, then the adaptations are going to make you better at doing that number of sets and that number of reps. And so if you do very high weight and very low reps, guess what you're going to get better at doing? High weight and low reps. If you do lighter weight and you do more reps, then at some point you're no longer resistance training, but you're going to get better at doing a lighter weight and more time. Does that make sense? And this is the part where, you know, the bros put the heavy weight on the bench press, and some of the lady bros have their little pink 5-pound dumbbells, and they're doing like sets of 50 or something on curls, or the world's like, I call them drop. They think they're doing kickbacks, but they're really just like dropping the weight down. You know, you've seen them do this, right? And those kinds of things. What do they get better at doing? They're getting better at lifting that 5-pound dumbbell over and over and over again, even though it's really easy for them anyway. They're probably not getting a lot of overload. So we'll talk a little bit about kind of how that stuff matters, which of those things is the most important. Okay? Okay. So let's get this out of the way at the start. All right? This is the end game of all of this. This is the very applicable kind of ideas here. How strong can you get? Okay? Well, the answer, of course, is it depends. And it depends greatly on how strong you are to begin with. Okay? But in general, over 3 to 6 months, most people can gain somewhere between 25 to 100% in strength. Okay? Now, this assumes a person is pretty untrained. They're not used to doing this kind of resistance training to begin with. Okay? So I know that Ryan does a fair amount of resistance training. I don't think that in 6 months we could get Ryan to double how strong she is in some lifts. Could we get 25%? Maybe, if we pick something that she's not that used to doing. I don't know. We're going to tend to get bigger increases in people that are a complete novice at doing something, okay? And even if you do lift weights a bunch, if you take up a new kind of exercise, right? Like you've never done Olympic lifts before, you've never done a deadlift, or you've never done, I don't know, you've never done a clean and press or something, then even though you may be very well trained otherwise, you're not very used to doing that. You may be able to get this kind of massive increase in strength there. It's just going to depend. Okay? Increases in strength tend to be greater doing dynamic contractions, so things that are concentric, eccentric movements. Okay? Much more so than increases in isometric strength. Okay? So if we have you do a bunch of squats, your squat 1RM is going to go up to a much greater extent than if we put you in the squat rack and we anchor the squat rack and we have you get under it and push on a force plate up as hard as you can go and get your maximal isometric contraction at a particular joint angle while doing a squat motion. Your MVC is not going to go up nearly as much as what your 1 rep max on that squat is going to go up. We'll talk about a little bit of the why behind all of that, okay? Talk a little bit about that as we go forward. Okay? Strength gains are very, very often related to initial strength and genetic potential, and they tend to be similar between men and women and old people and young people, okay? If we normalize to muscle mass or we normalize to initial starting strength in response to training, men and women get equally as strong, okay? Until like the 1990s, we didn't think that was the case because nobody bothered to check against their starting strength, okay? So it was like, oh, well, we're going to take Callie, we're going to take Keldon. Callie can lift 100 pounds, Keldon can lift 150 pounds, and then we have them train for 6 months, and Callie's goes up by 50 pounds, and Keldon's goes up by 75 pounds, and it's relatively the same percent increase, but now Keldon is lifting a larger, he is lifting a larger weight. His weight went up to a larger extent than Callie, so clearly Keldon got a better training response. That probably seems silly to you guys. It seems very silly to me, but we have a just long, drawn-out, terrible history of the patriarchy in science and society and everything else. And so, ladies, you all got penalized. They're like, oh, look, the women they don't respond like men. As it turns out, they do. So we take men and women that are roughly the same size and roughly the same initial strength, which those studies have been done, and you train them, and their muscles get about the same of an increase, and their strength goes up about the same. Okay? So, old people and young people, the old people part, old folks can get hypertrophy up into maybe their mid-70s or about 80. After 80, they can still increase their strength, but they may begin to lose some of their ability to get hypertrophy as they get to be really, really old. We don't fully understand kind of why that's going to be the case. Okay? All right. As you get stronger, okay, these are the things that we're going to talk about for pretty much the next 2 lectures. There are 2 things that happen that make you get stronger. There are people that will argue that one of these things is actually not the case, that it happens, but it doesn't play a role in making you stronger. I vigorously disagree with that, but whatever. Okay? You are going to have what we call neural adaptations. There will be changes in the way the nervous system, in the way that your brain signals through your motor neurons, down the axons to the neuromuscular junction. There will be changes in the way the nervous system controls the muscle and has it contract. Okay? That's one way you're going to get stronger. Okay? All of you can probably get better at doing that. You have a certain amount of muscle, you can get better at turning on and using the muscle that you already have. Okay? The other adaptation we call a contractile protein adaptation. This is the idea of hypertrophy. This is the idea that your muscle will get bigger. You will physically have more muscle, more actin, more myosin, more cross bridges. Therefore, you now have a bigger muscle, and so you have a greater potential to generate force. There are some people that will argue that the contractile protein adaptation contributes 0% to the increases in strength seen after resistance training, and there's a puppy dog outside. I disagree with this. They have a little bit of scientific evidence that helps them make their case, but they don't have enough to convince me fully. so the time course and individualized contribution of each of these components is going to be different. We're going to talk about that. Which one happens first and why? Which ones happens later and why? Okay? Which ones are going to happen to a greater extent in untrained people versus trained people, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so here we go. Have I shown you guys these data before? I think I showed them to my undergrad class then. So maybe Colin and Callie and Ryan have seen these, but they probably forgot. Okay, these are data. Okay, and for those of you guys that are in stats, this is a histogram. Okay, a frequency distribution histogram, and it is data from almost 600 participants, men and women. Okay, and they did 12 weeks of training with one bicep. So they did curls basically 3 times a week. Okay, the first month they did 3 sets of 12 at their 12 RM. The next 4 weeks they did 3 sets of 8 at their 8 RM, which the 12 RM and the 8 RM, that's just a weight you can lift 12 times, but not a 13. 8 RM is a weight you can lift 8 times, but not 9. So they did a little bit of progressive changes there. Every month they reassessed their 1 rep max, and then they altered their percentages to kind of get there. What you see here is increase in 1 rep max strength gain. What you see down here is change in MVC, so isometric contraction. And what I want you to note is that the mean increase in men in their 1 RM was about 40%. In women, it was about 65%. Okay, so we got lots of women out here, ladies. This big kind of almost 15% of subjects got about 100% stronger, got this doubling. So we can kind of look at this frequency distribution, and you see most people are kind of clustering down here. We've got some lady that got like 200 and I don't know, 20, 240% stronger. Okay, and then we had some people that basically did not increase their strength whatsoever. Okay. Similarly, you look at here's maximal voluntary contraction change, and it's much, much tighter distribution on all of these things, right? Men and women are relatively similar, about 15% in men, about 22% in women. So again, women were a little bit larger increase, but this is a much smaller increase than this. Remember that I told you guys that you gain more strength, right? In 1 rep max. Well, they were training using their 1 rep max. That's why they got stronger there. We have some data from our lab, and there's lots of data from other labs. If they had trained isometrically, then that would make their EBC go up to potentially a greater extent than it might make their 1 rep max go up. The adaptations are very, very specific. Okay? The nervous system learns how to perform the types of contractions that you do most often. Okay? So, look, strength change, 1 rep max, somewhere between 40 and maybe 60%, somewhere between 15 and 20% in MVC. Here is the change in actual cross-sectional area. So this is measured using an MRI. There were, like I said, almost 600 people. This was done across multiple sites. It was done at UMass Amherst, at Yale, and I think Boston University. And what you can see from all of this, here's the distribution of changes in muscle size. Relatively similar in men and in women, 20% versus 18%. And you'll see that the vast majority, right, if we were to look at our standard deviations, almost everybody is going to be within this, say, 5 to maybe 28 or 30% change in things. You have some folks whose arms got smaller, and some folks that got giant, okay, out of all of this. There are always outliers. Why? I don't know. Genetics. You all probably have that friend that looks at the weight room, they think about lifting weights, and they just Superman, right? Something like that. And you all probably know, or maybe it's you, know people that resistance train a bunch and their muscles never get any bigger. So it's kind of this normal distribution. So similar between men and women in this. I will point out that look at the change in muscle size. Much more closely tracks with the change in maximal voluntary contraction. What we think is that changes in MVC strength are especially when you're not training using MVCs, are going to be more indicative or more closely mimic the changes in muscle size. Whereas doing the dynamic contraction that is much more like what you've been training with is going to show a much larger kind of improvement change. So we'll do a little bit more. I'll show you guys some data on that in a few slides. Okay. All right. So let's talk now about neural adaptations. I'm going to give you guys some information, and then we'll go through some of the scientific evidence on which this summary is based. Okay. Some people call this neural adaptation a learning effect. Okay. You guys ever done something and it feels really awkward and you feel very uncoordinated doing it? Like if you were to ask me to get on Jacob's skateboard, okay, you feel very awkward, and then you do it again and again and again, and it begins to you feel more coordinated, right? That's a neural effect. That's the nervous system learning how to contract muscles and generate force in a manner that is going to be better for whatever that task is. Okay? So what we are learning to do is to recruit more of the muscles, and also in some instances to recruit accessory muscles or things like that that are going to help us generate more force. So what adapts? And I put in parentheses, we don't really know, and that, I mean, that's not 100% true. We have some ideas of what adapts, but we do know that with resistance training, we tend to have an increased ability to recruit high threshold, so type 2, particularly type 2X motor units. You all remember that when you do any kind of a contraction, you tend to use your slowest type 1 motor units all the time. So we're good at turning those on. If you don't ever do things that require high levels of force or very fast contractions, you're not going to get a lot of practice at recruiting and turning on those largest, kind of fastest motor units. So when you do resistance training, you're going to be forced to do some of that. So you're going to get better. You're going to learn how to do that. Okay. We do also tend to see an increase in what we call synchronization of motor unit recruitment. So the firing rates of each individual motor unit that you have that's getting turned on will tend to line up more closely. And so you get these, it's like waves adding together. You'll get this bigger sort of crest and get potentially a little bit more force by doing all of that. You should, we have pretty reasonable evidence, even though it's kind of difficult to measure, we should see a decreased inhibition from the Golgi tendon organs. If you all remember that the Golgi tendons sense force production, right? And when they sense high force levels, they make the antagonist muscle contract and they shut off the muscle that is generating the high force. There seems to be some tuning down, basically, of the inhibition from those. We may, and this is a little bit of a controversial one, we may see an increase in firing rate to those motor units. It kind of depends upon which motor units we measure, and it depends upon what kind of contraction we're doing as to what's going to happen. We have some experimental issues that are problems with how we can measure firing rates and make that one a little kind of muddier picture. Okay? The time course of change in these things. So neural adaptations happen immediately. Okay, immediately. We make Alex do something today. He's going to have a neural adaptation to be better at that potentially by tomorrow. Okay, especially if it's having them do something you don't do very often. Okay? So, I don't know, Alex, what do you not do very often from a weight training standpoint? Training arms. Okay, so we're going to have Alex do some curls, some shoulders, right, today. Or you said it was back and bi, do a little lat pull down, do some rows or something, okay? Do that today. Assess his 1 rep max on doing a lat pull down today. If he doesn't do it very often, there's a reasonable chance that he can come back tomorrow or maybe on Saturday, and we can do it again, and he's immediately going to be strong. Not by a lot, but maybe 3 or 4 pounds or 5 pounds or something. Neural adaptations happen very, very quickly. Okay? They tend to occur well before any measurable increase in cross-sectional area. you guys will see it typically takes maybe 6 to 8 weeks to see noticeable to the eye differences or increases in cross-section area. You're going to see neural adaptations almost immediately, certainly within like a week. Okay? So, useful facts. Neural adaptations are primarily the thing responsible for the increase in strength seen in the first 8 weeks or thereabouts of training. Okay? People that are novices at doing something are going to get a lot stronger, a lot faster doing a particular lift. Okay? Because they're going to get these very rapid neural adaptations that are going to take place. And then they're going to get to a place where they're pretty good at doing that exercise. They're pretty good at recruiting all of the motor units that they have, right, to perform that activity. So then they have to wait for the muscle to actually get bigger for them to do it. Okay? Adaptations are very, very specific to exercise type and contraction type. So if you're used to doing one arm preacher curl bench curls, you're going to get better at doing one arm preacher curl bench curls. Okay, you're going to see the biggest change, the biggest sort of increase in strength doing that. You may get a little bit of a transfer if you're doing like a two arm standing kind of free range curl, but they're generally going to be very, very specific to the type of exercise that you do. That's going to create some challenges for us. There's also a thought that this may be the only way that very, very advanced lifters can improve their strength. So you take a person that has trained for a very long time. If we make an assumption that they have reached their kind of natural limit of how big their muscles can get, then further neural adaptations will be the only way that they can build. So there's also something, I don't know if I have data on this for you. There's something called the crossover effect. And what that means is you can train one arm, that arm gets stronger, so does the other arm. Okay? Train one leg, and the other leg gets stronger. It doesn't seem to be as much transfer that if you train an arm, then your legs get stronger. But that's called the crossover effect. It is very clearly driven by a neural adaptation of the nervous system. We think a lot of that is that things cross over from the hemispheres of the brain, and that the motor cortex recognizes and learns how better to generate the proper motor pattern to do the contractions in like the arm that you've been using, but it remembers that motor pattern and it's easier for it to then generate a similar motor pattern in the contralateral arm. Okay? So pretty fascinating kinds of things. And that also has some really interesting applications in physical and occupational therapy. All right, to some data. Okay, these are old data, older than you guys, not older than me, but old. Okay, these are from a fellow named Marco Narici, who is obviously Italian and quite a big deal. He still has a lab and puts out a lot of really good stuff, but this is some of their early work. What you can see here in these two panels, I have a trained leg, okay, and I have an untrained leg. So this is your data on the trained leg. This is an untrained leg. I have a period of time that was about 60 days, okay? So 2 months or 8 weeks of training, followed then by another 60 days of detraining or not doing anything. And what you can see here in the top panel is the cross-sectional area. This is in the quad, I believe. This is their cross-sectional area. Here's their maximal voluntary contraction strength, and then this is a signal from something that we call integrated EMG. This is a surface electrode put on the muscle that we use to measure the kind of total electrical signal from the peripheral axon to the sarcolemma. Okay? And so what you can see, let's start down here on the bottom with NVC. After about 60 days, so after about 2 months of training, their strength was 120% of where they started, so they're about 20% stronger. Okay? Then they stop training and voila, it goes away. You will also note in the untrained leg that they got a little bit stronger, about half as strong in the untrained leg. This half is about what other people tend to see. The fact that it took that long in them is strange. Most people will see a cross-training effect within happens pretty quickly, much like what happens here in the training lab. Okay. I want you all to note that as they trained, that their muscle got almost 10% bigger. So there was, and this is measured with MRI, so it got bigger, then it came back down and got smaller again. Their untrained leg, no change whatsoever, right? So it didn't get bigger, but it did get stronger. This one got stronger, it got bigger. Then if you look at the integrated EMG response, this is a very, very kind of gross measure of the ability of the nervous system to turn that muscle on. Okay? It's not a great measure, but it's better than having nothing. And so you will note that, as you can see, as we get out here to like the end of our 2 months of training, that what appears to be that nervous system signal has gotten significantly bigger. Okay, a lot more of this than we're getting in cross-sectional area. So in that 8 weeks, a lot of this increase in strength is due to this. And you will note that we're seeing this increase in EMG signal in the contralateral leg. But both of them are going to then kind of go away. So this is some of the first data showing us increases in strength combined with increases in cross-sectional area and central nervous system signaling to those working muscles. Okay. Not that long ago, 30 years. Okay, not that long ago. Okay, so what other sorts of data do we have to demonstrate that there are changes in, let's just say, recruitment, the ability to turn on motor units after a bout of resistance training or after some sort of resistance training? So what you see here are some data from Lori Plouts. This was done while Lori was postdoc at NASA. NASA is very, very interested in strength training and maintenance of muscle mass, as well as cardiovascular adaptations. I think I have told you guys that basically they think that they have the capabilities for us to get to Mars from a rocket and the engineering side of things. They can build the ships, they can do the things that can get us there. It's the ability of the kind of human exercise physiologist to be able to have people get there and be in any kind of shape to function. That is probably the kind of catch point right now. Anyway, Lori's a department chair at the University of Michigan now, but what you can see here are some data that look a little counterintuitive to you, and I'll try to walk you through all of this. They had 9 men, they trained one leg, they trained their left leg. So they trained 2 times a week, 3 to 6 sets of 12 reps. And what we found from all of this is, here is their pre-training 1 rep max, and their pre-training, cross-sectional area. And then here's their post-training 1 rep max and their post-training cross-sectional area. So what I want you to see is that 1 rep max went up in both legs. Okay, they trained their left leg, so it went up about double in the left leg, just like we would expect. Their muscle size got bigger in the trained leg, but not in the untrained leg. So that's just like what Narichi showed. But what we can see here is this was a way of using MRI to try to estimate how much of a muscle was being activated during a particular kind of bout of resistance training. And so you can do something called T2 weighted imaging. It's what they use and oftentimes now to diagnose hamstring tears or muscle tears. The T2 signal is very sensitive to the accumulation of fluid or water. And so you do contractions, right? You increase blood flow and things into those working skeletal muscles. You drive fluid out of the interstitial space into those muscles. And that change can then be picked up on the MRI. And so here's the right leg pre to post, and here's the left leg pre to post. And they lifted several different kind of the same absolute submaximal load. And so you can see they lifted 25 kilograms, 35 kilograms, 45 kilograms, or 60 kilograms. And what I want you to note is that in the post in both legs, they were using less muscle to lift the same amount of weight. And so the idea behind this was you're being more efficient at using the nervous system. Right? So Narichi shows us that from a maximal standpoint, as maximal strength goes up, maximal ability to turn on that muscle goes up. This one shows in a relative sense that as you get stronger, you're going to use less muscle, because the nervous system is more efficient at turning on the muscle that you have to perform any kind of the same cell types you look at. Okay, now both of those things are somewhat older studies. Okay, I'm going to show you some data now that are more recent and use a more widely accepted experimental technique that actually measures motor unit recruitment, or does a much better job of estimating motor unit recruitment. Okay? And so what you can see here in these data from ECMOM is what we call a measure of voluntary activation percentage. So we have a training, kind of before and after, and then we have a control. So these were two separate groups of people, basically. But you will note that the voluntary activation percentage went from about 80% up to about 90% in our training group. So what we do with all of this, let me back up, sorry, with all of this, and this is a technique that we do in my lab, that Dr. Pereira can do in his lab, and Dr. Mike can do in his lab. And what we have you do is imagine that I'm taking my left leg and I'm going to kick out, do an isometric contraction. I'm going to kick as hard as I possibly can. Okay. While I am kicking, we put these big electrical stimulation electrodes over my muscle, and we zap my muscle with a significant amount. That seem right? Call it a significant amount of electricity. And we run enough electricity in that we feel certain that that electricity is sufficient to turn on every motor unit in your quad muscles. Okay? And if you are interested about this, we can talk about kind of how we know that or why we think that in those things. But you kick, while you're kicking, we zap your muscle and we look to see if we can get more force out of that muscle. If we can get more force, then that tells us that as I'm kicking, I am not voluntarily able to turn on or recruit all of the motor units, all of that muscle in my leg. Okay? And so what they found in the quad here is about 80%, which is not, it's not great. That's pretty reasonable for an untrained person, up to about 90%. Okay? Very, very highly trained people in their quads may be in the low to mid 90s. There's plenty of data, like if you look at smaller muscles, like in your arms or in the TA or your soleus or something, people can get much closer to 100%. It's very, very rare for us to get 100% activation or 100% motor recruitment. So again, there's lots and lots of studies that have done this. I'm just kind of trying to show you guys the evolution of how we have attempted to measure these things. Okay. So there's another thing that we think is going to change. Let me back up. No, let me say it in a different way. So if we have the ability to measure and determine that we think after training, you've increased the ability to turn on the motor units, to turn on more motor units in the spinal cord, to polarize more alpha motor neurons, okay, which then means I turn on more muscle and therefore I get more force. Then the question becomes, well, how do we do that? Okay? Is that change that's taking place in the brain, right? Is the motor cortex sending a bigger signal down to the spinal cord? Is there something that changes at the level of the motor neurons, right? Is there something that changes in the axons? Like how exactly, we know that the change happens, but how do we figure out like where is it going on? And so what you guys can see here, these are some data from a gentleman in Denmark. His name is Per Agard. And so they have two separate measures here. And these are both things that, again, we've measured in my lab and published with. And Dr. Pereira has measured these things and done some things. We measure something called a V wave and something called the H reflex. Okay? And so they had a group of individuals where they measured them before training and then they measured them after training. So before and after. Okay? And so what you can see from all of this, and I'll explain what these things are, is the V wave is a rough way to measure the amount of action potentials or the amount of input coming out of the motor cortex. Okay? Coming out of the motor cortex. I should probably say that that's not true. it's probably better or more precise to say that the V wave is a measure of all of the neural signals that are getting through the alpha motor neuron. Okay, from the motor cortex down, they're getting through the motor neuron. The H reflex is something that we can use to measure how easy or difficult it is to make the motor neurons in the spinal cord depolarize. Okay. So you can get both of these two things simultaneously. This is very often done either in the plantar flexors. Jeez, I don't know those days. Done in the plantar flexors. So we would put an electrode over your tibial nerve behind your knee, and we can zap and make your foot do plantar flexion. So you would point your toe. Okay? And we can essentially measure the size and the time that it takes from a signal to get from your tibial nerve behind your knee actually down into the muscle. And so we can evoke something called an H reflex, and we can do an H reflex during the contraction, and it gives us this V wave. But what you can see from both of these things, the take home is there is evidence that you're able to achieve greater motor unit recruitment for two reasons. One, because the H reflex goes up, the motor neurons in the spinal cord become easier to depolarize. Their resting membrane potential is going to shift, okay, to a more positive state. It's going to shift towards that threshold potential required for depolarization. And the V wave is going to tell us, and we have information from some where we do stimulation either of the brain directly or kind of right below the motor cortex here, at the very, very top of the spinal cord, that we are also getting a larger input from the motor cortex. Okay? So you get more input from the motor cortex. Because the alpha motor neurons are easier to polarize, more of that motor cortex input is going to make it through. So we're going to depolarize more motor neurons. That's going to then lead to greater recruitment of muscle fibers in the muscle and ideally more force. Okay? Do you guys follow? Kind of see where we're going, kind of why I laid this out in the way that I did. Like, overarching, this is what it looks like. You get stronger. We know that we're getting more electrical signal through, okay? We know that we're recruiting more motor neurons. Here's kind of why we did that stuff. Okay? Kind of the underlying mechanism, the underlying changes that are going to kind of get at some of those things. Okay? Good with that. Okay. Remember that I told you guys that changes in recruitment and changes in the neural adaptations were very, very task specific, right? That if you do one arm preacher curl bench curls, you're going to get better at turning on the muscle during those one arm preacher curl bench curls. Here are some data, okay, that are going to hopefully drive home more of what I mean by things are task specific. So here are some very, very old data. I think Vince retired last year, but it's from Vince Kaizo. And what you can see here is this is the effect of how fast you perform the contractions during training on how much stronger you get at different velocities of contraction. Okay? So here in this one, they were training at about 90 degrees per second. Okay? 90 degrees per second. Not super duper slow, but not super duper fast either. Okay? So if you imagine I'm doing a curl, it's about a 1 second up, okay? Or about 1.5 seconds to get all the way up, depending upon just how big your biceps are and how much range of motion you have, okay? And so this one's training at 96 degrees per second. Here they were training at 240 degrees per second, so very fast, okay? Training slow or moderately, training very, very fast. Here you can see they've done, this is a concentric torque velocity curve, okay? How strong they are versus here is zero velocity all the way out to very, very fast, okay? Now, the thing is in radians per second. We can convert radians into an actual thing. There's 2 pi radians. It's going to equal 360 degrees, so we can just do some division there. But the take home, when I train slower, I get stronger at slower velocities. I get relatively stronger at slow velocities than I do at faster velocities. When I train very fast, I do not get stronger at slow velocities, but I get stronger at faster velocities. Okay? And you can hopefully see why that when I train slowly, I'm lifting more weight, I'm generating more force, which is probably why I'm learning to contract at these slow velocities, so I get better effects here, not so good out here. So this is an interesting thing that they figured out, in the early 80s, but isn't always appreciated by people who train for sports, right? We, for the most part, have a pretty good handle on all of this. Now, what this tells us is that when you lift very, very heavy weights slowly, right? You're doing very heavy squats, you're going to get better at doing very heavy squats. And for the most part, athletes don't do anything slowly. Right? The idea is to maximize speed and force so you can generate power. And so we may need to alter to some extent kind of how we integrate training at both kind of low or moderate and high velocities in an effort to be more, get greater performance increases in our particular sports. Okay? Here is the same thing that we showed earlier, but this is the type of contraction. So here's 12 weeks of training. I believe this was during doing knee extension, right? And so you will see that when we ask the person to see how much they can increase the weight that they were lifting during training, right? So this is like a 1 rep max or kind of a dynamic contraction. They got much, much stronger, and their increase in isometric strength in that same kind of group of muscles was much, much smaller. It goes up, but to a much smaller degree than it does in that way. So again, if you want to get better at doing dynamic contractions, you have to do dynamic contractions. Most people don't train doing isometric contractions. We did a study, Rami is working on getting it written up as part of his dissertation in our lab, where we did isometric training, and shockingly, people get a lot better at generating isometric force. But that's not something that a lot of people do. Sports don't usually do a lot of isometrics, for instance. Okay? So again, changes in recruitment, neural adaptations are very, very specific to task. Right? So you guys remember that I told you that there was maybe a chance that there are changes in firing rates, okay? That the number of action potentials that are coming out of the brain through the motor neurons may go up, okay? So here's a little bit of data on all of this. Out of Gary Kamen's lab in Australia. It's not the most overwhelming and convincing kind of thing, and I'll try to explain to you guys why that's the case in just a minute. They did isometric training 5 times a week for 6 weeks, okay? They did 2 sets of 10, and each contraction was a 10-second MVC. These contractions are taking place in the flexor digitorum intermedius, so the FDI muscle, thing that makes your index finger go out like this. Okay? So it's push, 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 relax. Push as hard as you can, push, 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 relax. Okay? Keep that in mind. These are things that they have recorded motor unit discharge rates from needle EMG electrodes. They've taken these little individual wire electrodes and they jam them into your muscle, and then they ask you to contract the muscle. And the wires are small enough and they fish them around in there to where they feel like they are recording data from the axon that goes to one motor unit. Okay? So you may have like 10 or 15 or 20 little needles in that one little muscle, each of them getting very, very near to the axon that controls that particular movement. Okay? these things using fine wire electrodes, or trying to use the surface, we don't jam needles into you analogs where we do some kind of fancier stuff with EEG that we can do in my lab or Dr. Pereira can do. It's kind of crap, but these things only work during isometric contractions, because if the muscle shortens, it changes shape and the needle is now not near, especially that very small muscle, now the needle is not near that axon anymore, okay? And you get crosstalk, and it's, so you have to appreciate that we are using a muscle that is very small, that may not be necessarily representative of other larger muscles. We're doing training and contraction types that are not necessarily that indicative of what people do under normal training circumstances or in their everyday life. And doing that, okay, we can see potentially over our training days, we may be able to see this slight, especially in our younger folks, this slight increase in motor unit discharge rate. Maybe 6 or 7 or 8 hertz of an increase in firing rates during these maximal contractions. Okay? We don't, in this one, they didn't see it in old people. Okay? So they got stronger, firing rate goes up. They make the argument that it's because the firing rate they got stronger. Okay? Maybe. Not, there are studies that don't find things like this, that show no changes. Okay? We have tried to look at some things in our lab, and the folks at Oklahoma State, Dr. Beck, who was here before Dr. Pereira, they did some things where we put these surface EMG electrodes on. It's one little electrode, but it has 5 individual recorders, and you can try to basically have people ramp up in a contraction and ramp down. You can try to pull out firings from individual motor units, and we don't necessarily see things like this. We see some other changes that are indicative that recruitment and maybe firing changes, but you can't record all of them. You don't know if you're recording the same motor unit every time you put them on before and after training. It's all fraught with. This is really, really difficult neuroscience stuff to do. So I present this so that there is evidence that firing rates may increase. Take that all with a grain of salt. Okay? Take that all with a grain of salt. Much, much more evidence that spinal excitability changes, that motor cortex output increases, and that motor unit recruitment in general is going to change. We've got lots of evidence for that. Firing rate stuff is a little iffy.
Why do you think they use this instead of a bigger muscle?
So it's on the surface. It's clean. You don't have to go through a lot of fat in people to get the electrodes in. That's kind of the biggest sort of thing. And then like in the quad, because you have like thousands of motor units, it's just more, it's a little more. They do things in the quad, they do it in the TA a lot. They'll sometimes do it in the soleus or one of the ends of the gastron. But a lot of times they do stuff. A lot of the early stuff is all done with FDI or muscle out here. A lot of it's right here. It's easy. So that's why. And it tends to be a muscle that is not that strength training. So you can see big effects. Have a great chance to change that. Okay. Okay. So other things that happen. Okay. So in normal class, I would have you guys get up and like wrestle with each other. Not wrestle, like push against each other. If we were in the conference room, I'd get you to have a chair, and like Keldon would push on the chair, and Alex would try to resist against the chair. Okay. And the point of all of this is that every time you contract the muscle, okay, when you contract your bicep, you're not just contracting your bicep, because your brain is worried that we need to make sure that the elbow doesn't like rip itself to shreds and things. You're going to experience something called a co-contraction. And generally, in an effort to stabilize joints, you have the agonist muscle, so I do a curl, okay? My bicep contracts, my tricep also contracts a little bit. And that is meant to try to stabilize the elbow joint as best we can. Okay? You do your knee, you do a knee extension, your quads are activated, your hamstrings are also activated. Okay? So you have to imagine that when I lift a weight, I need force to lift the weight against gravity, and I also need additional force to overcome whatever opposing force the antagonist muscle is generating. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay? And so what we know that happens with resistance training is, as you learn how to do these things, you shut off the antagonist muscle to a greater and greater extent during any kind of thing. And so these are some of one of the first studies that ever found this. Here is knee extension force, okay? From start to 8 weeks of training, so the knee extensions are getting stronger. Here's the EMG signal from one of the hamstrings. And you guys will note that it takes about a week, but after a week, we're going to have decrease in antagonist co-activation in response to this. So while we're getting an increase in motor unit recruitment, while we may be getting an increase in muscle size and all these things that are happening in the knee extensors, we are also getting less opposing force out of the hamstrings, and that will also contribute to some extent to our increase in force production. Okay? So, there we go. What the hell is this? Okay, yeah, I remember that. Okay, so this is always fun. What happens, okay, and maybe they don't, I don't know, you guys that do strength training things now, maybe people argue about this, but when I was a grad student, this was something people argue about all the time. Should I train using, if I want to do curls again, right, should I train one arm, each arm individually, okay? Should I train them on a bench, like on a preacher curl bench, or should I do like free range of motion kind of things? Or is it okay if I train both of them simultaneously, like doing curls like this, okay? Same thing for, should I do one leg knee extension? Should I do double leg knee extension? Do I need to do squats? Like this idea of, is it better to train each individual limb separate from all of the other ones? Okay? Sheldon, what do you think?
It depends.
Do people argue about this now? Do people still get all bent out of shape about things like this? How dare you do 2-arm curls? You need to do like 1-arm curls or something. Your left arm is along for the ride because your right arm dominant or something.
Maybe, yeah.
Sometimes? Okay. So everybody has a bit of a different opinion. Okay? What these data are going to show you guys, okay, is there's a group that trained bilaterally, doing both arms at the same time. And then there was a group that trained one arm at a time. Okay? We then tested their strength change doing a 1-arm curl versus doing 2-arm curls. Okay? Do you all want to wager a guess as to how this goes? When I train using both arms, what am I going to get stronger to a greater extent doing?
Training both arms.
Both arms. Okay? When I train using one arm, I'm going to get a relatively larger increase in strength when I do my test with one arm versus two. Right? So here is bilateral 1 rep max. My group that trained bilaterally got right. They got up here about a 20% change. My group that trained unilaterally got stronger doing both of them simultaneously, but not as strong. My group that trained unilaterally got stronger in both, but they got stronger to a greater extent in unilaterally. You can see here's the EMG signals from all of those that correspond. Again, training adaptations, the neural adaptation is specific to the kind of contraction. It's specific to the speed of contraction. It's specific to, are you using one arm or one leg or both, right? You get better at doing whatever it is that you're doing when you train. Okay? If you take nothing else away from this entire lecture, not today, but just in general, it's I want you to go over to the hub and I want you to troll people and tell them that they're in there wasting their damn time doing some shit that does not matter. They're not getting better at anything. Or whatever it is that they're getting better at is of no consequence to anything. Okay? So, but again, people care about this to a great extent, right? I'm an athlete. I'm an offensive lineman, right? Am I ever pushing with both arms at exactly the same time on the same person? Or am I back and I got a set and I got somebody coming here and I got somebody coming there? So I mean, there is some legitimate questions about for different athletes based upon what their sport requires as to whether or not they need to train things unilaterally or bilaterally in order to evoke the best and most specific adaptation that will apply to whatever it is they're going to do. What's going to freak Kelvin out is when I tell him that all the weight training that they do in basketball probably has a completely negligible effect on the basketball player's ability to actually play basketball in some ways. I don't believe that at all. But there are people that will make that argument, and there is some evidence that, right? But you take 18-year-olds, they're not very strong. I mean, you get stronger, you can jump high. We have lots of data on all of that kind of thing. Right? You're in a basketball game, you don't do a lot of bench pressing. Right? But you might do this, right? So maybe we need to train this. Not only do I need to train my shot, but I need to train my tricep by being up over my head or something like that. So there's going to be some very, very kind of high level specificity that if you want to train athletes, even I don't want to say high school age athletes. High school kids are the easiest people in the world to train because no matter what you do with them, they're going to get better because they've never done anything. They've never done a squat. Make them squat. Plus, they're going through like puberty, a bunch of them. They're going to get a lot bigger and a lot stronger. Okay, it's the college men and women, it's the professional men and women where things have become much trickier to kind of hone in on how much strength do they need, how much sport-specific stuff do they need, how do we combine all of these things together, and then when we want to train them, how do we go about doing that in a way to maximize the transfer of their adaptations from like what we can research measure to their actual sport. Okay. This will be our last one for today. Okay. This is maybe, and I put this in here, one, because the data are really interesting and important, but it may be the single worst representation of data in a journal article that is actually real and cool and interesting that I've ever seen. Okay? I mean, I was graduating high school the year that it came out, so clearly I was not a reviewer for any of these things. But as someone that loves a graph, as Ryan will learn to her detriment, okay? And I want things to be shown in a very clear, very particular manner. This one is shit, okay? What we have here, okay? This is from a very, very famous exercise physiologist. His name is Tibor Hortobagi. He was in East Carolina now. I think now he's in Australia somewhere. But here is changes in eccentric 1 rep max, changes in concentric 1 rep max, changes in the EMG signal during the eccentric 1 rep max, and changes in the eccentric signal during the concentric 1 rep max. Okay? That's the easy part. Now it gets confusing because they didn't do things in the right way. What you can see here, they had 2 groups of people. One group trained, I think it was like 12 weeks, doing eccentric only training, doing the down portion of a squat, basically. Okay? I think it's knee extension, and so they did the down portion on the knee extension. Okay? What you can see here then is we had a group that trained eccentrically, we had a group that trained only concentrically. Sorry, I should have pointed that out to you. Eccentric only training, concentric only training. Here is their eccentric 1 rep max, the change in strength. Black bars represent the eccentric group, white bars represent the concentric group. Here we have their change from pre to like 6 weeks in. Here we have their change from 6 weeks in to the end. And then here we have their pre to post. So pre to 12 weeks post. Ignore all of this, just look over here, okay? I don't know why this was in there. It doesn't particularly matter, and it just confuses things. So, probably unsurprising to you guys, when I train eccentrically, I get a whole lot stronger eccentrically than if I train concentrically, right? Specificity of adaptation. If you want to get stronger eccentrically, you have to train eccentrically, right? That is then accompanied by this relatively significant increase in the EMG signal during my eccentric contractions. We'll come back to that. That's really, they didn't talk about it in this one, but this has some really, really very, very kind of important things for later on. Also, unsurprisingly, if we look at my concentric 1-rep max, when I train concentrically, shockingly, I get stronger to a greater extent during concentric contractions than the group that trained eccentrically. Although my EMG signal change was not that much different. Okay? So got it. So this middle part is weird. The other problem, you're like, oh, look at this big change or whatever that's going on here in the EMG signal. There's not much change in the EMG signal. Look at the units on the y-axis. 0 to a 60% change, 0 to a 400% change. Okay? 0 to a 40% increase in strength, 0 to a 60% increase in strength. These graphs are not drawn to scale with each other. And so it makes it much more difficult to compare. You're like, oh, look, okay, during the concentric 1-rep max, I got about 15% of an increase here, and I got about a 10% increase in my eccentric group. Those don't look that far off. Oh, wait, sorry, it's a 100% increase, right? So that's where I get really upset about a shape. This was published in what is arguably one of the single best journals in our field. And the data are really, really cool, right? They're really cool, especially this finding here, which is really important for some of the work that I do. This big increase in the eccentric signal. But their graphs are just all over the place. Okay? All right. So hopefully you have been convinced that neural adaptations take place. You increase your ability to turn on motor units by having a bigger signal from the brain, an easier time of getting that signal and making the motor units in your spinal cord fire, okay? And that change is very, very specific to the type of contraction that you're doing compared to how you train, okay? The speed of contraction and whether you're doing things unilaterally or bilaterally. That's kind of our big take. All right, let us stop here for today. We will have a quiz on Tuesday of next week. I will be here in person. If any of you are here, feel free to come on the class. If you're not going to be here, then just hop on Zoom. We'll do the quiz over Zoom. We'll figure it out. Okay? For those of you that I will see next week, I will see you next week. Those of you that I don't, if you are traveling, please be safe. Keep your mask discipline up. Although, no, if you're going home, I won't see you again until the spring, potentially. So, but for someone like Pearson, maybe never again. So, if I'm not going to see you, then I won't see you. Thank you. There will be course evaluations. There will be other kinds of things. We'll see each other hopefully through Zoom between now. All right. That is all. If you have questions on your test, please let me know.